She was 21 years old and she had just been put out. There was no shouting. There was no slammed door. There was only a girl named Brielle who had moved her boyfriend onto the living room couch one Tuesday afternoon, and a rent split that had quietly stopped working overnight, and a duffel bag packed in silence by a young woman who had learned long before this moment that some walls cannot hold what they were not built to hold. Her name was Wren Calloway. She stood at the end of a gravel driveway in northwestern Connecticut on a cold Saturday morning in late March of 2024, with a canvas rucksack on her shoulder and a duffel bag at her feet, and a framed photograph of her dead father wrapped in an old flannel shirt at the top of the bag. She had $1.80 in her pocket. She had in the bank $1,104 saved across 3 years of mowing playing fields and plowing winter driveways at a small private school in Salisbury. She had 11 hand-drawn notebooks in a wooden milk crate she had not yet figured out how to carry. She had the small block plane her father had pressed into her hands 2 days before he died, and she had the memory of a single stone wall that had been standing for 222 years on a stretch of forgotten turnpike 4 miles north of the village where she had been born. She did not know yet that the wall was waiting for her. She did not know yet what was hidden inside it. She caught the bus from Salisbury down into Litchfield for $7, and she sat near the back with her duffel between her knees and her rucksack on her lap, and she watched the stone walls of the Litchfield Hills slide past the window in the gray light of a late winter morning that had not yet decided whether to be spring. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the kind of girl who is sitting on that bus. You have to go back. She had been born in 2003 at the end of a dirt lane outside the village of Cornwall Bridge, Connecticut, in the steep wooded country where the Litchfield Hills come down hard against the Housatonic River. The house she was born in was a small rented cottage at the back of a hayfield that had not been hayed in 20 years. It had a tin roof, a propane stove, and a single wood stove in the living room that her father fed every winter morning before sunrise. There was a converted chicken coop in the side yard set on a foundation of field stones her father had laid himself, and inside the chicken coop was a workbench, 2 hand planes, 3 saws, a set of chisels in a leather roll, and the smell of cherry sawdust that had soaked into the boards of the building so deeply that 13 years after her father stopped working there, you could still close your eyes inside that coop and know what the man had done for a living. His name was Alden Calloway. He was a furniture maker. He built Windsor chairs and shaker tables out of locally milled cherry and ash, working alone in the chicken coop 6 days a week from the time Wren was a baby in a wooden crib in the corner to the spring she was 11 years old and he was diagnosed. He sold his work at the craft fairs in Litchfield, in Sharon, and at a small consignment counter in a furniture gallery down in New Milford. He did not get rich. He did not try. He made enough chairs each year to keep the rent paid and the wood stove fed and to put a glass of milk on the table beside his daughter every night at supper. Alden was a quiet man. He measured things twice. He spoke in short sentences, the kind of sentences a man uses when he has already thought the long version through to the end and decided that the short one will hold. When he talked to his daughter, he talked to her the way he talked to his cherry boards, with respect for the grain and an interest in what was already there. And on Sunday mornings from the time Wren could walk, Alden took her out into the hills. They did not walk on the paved roads. They did not walk on the marked hiking trails. They walked on the old roads, the abandoned roads, the cart paths, and the discontinued town highways. And most of all, the old turnpikes, the chartered toll roads that had been laid out across the Litchfield Hills between the late 1700s and the early 1800s, and that had been given up one after another across the long, quiet death of the 19th century. The hills were full of these old roads. They ran through the second-growth forest like green corridors, with their stone walls still standing on both sides, with their original road surfaces gone to leaf mold and moss, and the slow upward pressure of tree roots with their milestones tilted or fallen or buried. Alden Calloway knew dozens of them. He had walked them all. He had been walking them since he was a boy. And on those Sunday mornings in the woods beside his daughter, Alden taught Wren how to read stone. He did not call it that. He did not formalize it. He simply showed her week after week, year after year, the difference between a wall built by a farmer clearing his own field in the 1780s and a wall built by a paid mason for a turnpike company in the 1820s. The farmer's wall was rough. The stones were unsorted, the face was uneven, and the largest rocks sat wherever they had landed. The mason's wall was different. The mason's wall was coursed. The stones had been sorted by size before they were laid. The largest stones sat on the bottom, and the smallest sat on the top, and the face had been worked smooth enough that a child could run her hand along the wall and not catch a knuckle on a single edge. Alden showed her local fieldstone, the gray-brown gneiss and schist of the Litchfield Hills. He showed her the paler quarry stone, more uniform, that the turnpike companies had paid extra for at the bridges and the toll houses because the toll houses were the public face of the road and the company had wanted them to look like something. He showed her how to read mortar. Lime mortar mixed by hand, set hard across 2 centuries until it was harder than the stone it bound. He showed her how to tell good mortar from bad, how to tell old mortar from new, how to feel a joint with a fingertip and know whether it had been laid by a man who knew his trade or a man who did not. She was 4, she was 5, she was 6, she was 8 years old when he took her to the toll house. It was a Sunday morning in late October of 2011. The sugar maples along the abandoned road were the burnt orange they turn in the Litchfield Hills in late October, and the leaves were thick on the old roadbed, and the air had the cold smell of the first frost. They walked north from Cornwall Bridge along an overgrown lane that had not been a road since the early 1900s, and they came to a small, square stone building standing alone in the woods at a junction where 2 abandoned turnpikes had once crossed. The building was 12 feet by 12 feet. The walls were 2 feet thick, coursed fieldstone, the work of a paid mason from the year 1802. There was a steep slate roof with 2 holes in it. There was a single chimney with the top 3 courses missing. There was an oak plank door that had been nailed shut from the outside at some point in the 20th century. There was 1 small window facing the road, the toll window, where a toll keeper had once leaned out and collected fares from passing wagons. The northwest corner of the building had begun to shift where a tree root had pushed under the foundation. A young sugar maple was growing against the south wall, close enough that its bark was beginning to scrape the stone. The building was failing, but it was standing. Alden Calloway put his hand flat against the south wall. He looked down at his daughter. He said, "Feel that." Wren put her hand on the stone. The stone was cold. She could feel the joint between the 2 of the courses under the heel of her palm, and she could feel the lime mortar in the joint, smooth and hard, the color of an old bone left out in the sun. "That's coursed field stone," her father said. "It was laid by a man who knew his trade. He sorted his stones before he set them. He put the biggest on the bottom and the smallest on the top, and he mixed his own mortar from lime and sand and water, and he laid this wall in 1802. He paused. He let her keep her hand on the stone. "That mortar is older than your great-great-grandfather, Wren. It's harder than the stone now. The stone might fail before the mortar does." She ran her finger along the joint. The mortar was as smooth as the inside of a clamshell. Alden said, "A wall like this will stand for 300 years if nobody pushes it over. The stone does not fail. The mortar does not fail. The only thing that fails in the end is the people who stop paying attention." She was 8 years old. She did not understand what her father was telling her. She would understand eventually. It would take her 13 more years. The cancer came in the early spring of 2014. It came in the way pancreatic cancer comes, which is to say that it had already been there for a long time before anybody knew. And by the time anybody knew, there was almost nothing left to do about it. Alden Calloway was 46 years old. He weighed 172 pounds the morning he was diagnosed. He weighed 112 the morning he died, which was a Tuesday morning in October of 2014, in the upstairs bedroom of the rented cottage outside Cornwall Bridge, with the window open because he had asked for it open, and with the smell of cherry sawdust still in the curtains from the chicken coop across the yard. Imogen Calloway sat on one side of the bed. Wren sat on the other. She was 11 years old. 2 days before he died, when his eyes were still clear and his hands could still hold a thing, Alden Calloway asked his daughter to come close. He reached down beside the bed and brought up the small wooden block plane he had used for 30 years, the one with the worn cherry handle and the steel blade he had sharpened more times than he could count. He pressed the plane into her hands. The plane was heavy for a child's hand. She held it. He said, "Wren, listen to me." She listened. He said, "If you ever walk by yourself into a place I have only shown you from the outside, I want you to remember something for me. Will you remember it?" She nodded. "That wall," he said, "the one I put your hand on. That wall taught you how to listen. You don't know yet what you were listening to. You will." She did not understand. She would not understand for a very long time. She kept the plane. She buried her father on a Saturday afternoon in October in the small cemetery behind the white clapboard church in Cornwall, and she stood next to her mother in a black dress that was already too short in the sleeves because she was 11 years old and growing fast, and she watched the men from the funeral home lower the pine box into the cold ground. She did not cry at the grave. She had cried for 2 days straight in the cottage, and there was nothing left for the grave. Her mother put a hand on the back of her neck and held it there for a long time, and then they walked back to the car together and they drove home. Imogen Calloway did not remarry. She did not date. She kept her job. For 23 years, she had been the rural mail carrier on the Cornwall route, driving the same 57-mile loop of dirt roads and paved 2 lanes 6 days a week in a right-hand drive Jeep, with the windows down in summer and the defroster on full in winter, delivering to the same 218 mailboxes she had memorized in her first month and had never needed to relearn because the route did not change and the mailboxes did not move. And the people who lived at the ends of the driveways were most of them the same people who had been there when she had started in 1999. After Alden died, she kept driving the route. She drove it the next morning. She drove it every morning for the next 12 years. The route was the only thing in her life that did not change, and after Alden died, she needed something that did not change. Wren rode with her on Saturdays and on school holidays. She had ridden with her mother on the route since she was small. She sat in the passenger seat, the left side, because the Jeep was right-hand drive for mailbox access. She watched the same houses and barns and stone walls and crooked mailbox posts go by 100 times, and she watched the way her mother drove, which was with a calm and unbroken attention that did not flag at the 1,000th pass any more than at the first. One Saturday morning in the winter, Wren was 12 with her face against the cold window and her boots on the floor mat and the heater hissing in the dashboard. She said to her mother, "Mom, don't you get bored?" Imogen did not take her eyes off the road. She said, "I don't drive this route to find what's the same, Wren. I drive it to find what's changed. If you don't see yesterday 1,000 times, you can't see today at all." That was what her mother gave her. Her father had given her stone. Her mother gave her the discipline of the second look. Wren started walking the old roads alone in the spring of 2015, when she was 12 on the first anniversary of her father's death. She walked from the cottage out to the Tollhouse. It took her almost 2 hours. She stood in front of the building and put her hand on the south wall, the way her father had put her hand on it 4 years earlier, and she said out loud to no one, "I can feel it, Dad." Then she walked home. She went back the next year. She went back the year after. By the time she was 14, she was walking every Sunday in every season, in rain and snow, and the wet heat of August, in the iron cold of January. She carried a small notebook in a waterproof pouch and a pencil sharpened to a point, and she sketched the stone walls. She found the old foundations, the fallen milestones, the cellar holes of farmhouses that had burned down 100 years before she was born. She drew them carefully. She drew the way her father had built, slowly, with attention, measuring with her eye what did not want to be measured. By the time she was 18, she had filled 11 notebooks. The notebooks were a record of every surviving stone structure on every abandoned road within a 10-mile radius of Cornwall Bridge. Nobody had asked her to make this record. Nobody had assigned it. She had simply done it, the way her father had simply walked, the way her mother had simply driven. Because the roads were there, and the stone was there, and a girl who has been taught to read stone at the age of 8 does not stop reading it at 18. The notebooks also became something else. Without her planning it, they became a record of change. She returned to the same walls year after year, and she began to notice what had shifted. Which walls had lost stones? Which mortar joints had opened up? Which foundations had begun to tilt? The record of change was in its quiet way more useful than the record of presence. The presence told her what was there. The change told her what was leaving. And by the time she was 16, Wren had understood with a flat and unsentimental clarity that most of what she was documenting was disappearing. The stone walls were being buried by leaf mold. The toll houses were being undermined by tree roots. In another 50 years, most of it would be gone, and her notebooks would be the only record that any of it had ever existed. Her mother looked through one of the notebooks once. It was a winter night in 2020. Wren was 17. Imogen sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and turned the pages slowly under the yellow light of the hanging lamp, looking at the elevation drawings of the stone walls, and the careful diagrams of the mortar joints, and the small pencil notes in the margins about which stones had moved since the previous spring. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and set her hand flat on the cover and said, "You draw the way your father built, like you're measuring something that doesn't want to be measured." Wren did not answer. It was the most precise thing her mother had ever said about either her father or herself. She would carry that sentence with her for the rest of her life. She finished high school in Cornwall in the spring of 2021. She did not apply to college. She did not have the money, and she did not have the desire. She got a job that summer as a groundskeeper at a small private school up in Salisbury, half an hour north of Cornwall Bridge, mowing playing fields and raking leaves, and in the winters, plowing the school's long gravel driveway with a truck-mounted plow. The job paid $16 an hour. It came with a shared apartment in the school's staff housing a converted carriage house behind the main building, where Wren lived for 2 years with another groundskeeper named Brielle Voss. The arrangement had worked. Brielle was loud where Wren was quiet, tall where Wren was small, careless where Wren was careful, but she was decent, and she paid her share on time, and she did not make a thing of Wren's habit of disappearing every Sunday morning before sunrise to walk in the woods alone. The arrangement had worked until it did not. In the second week of March 2024, a man named Wyatt began appearing in the apartment. He was Brielle's new boyfriend. He was pleasant enough. He had a Westie easy smile and a habit of leaving the bathroom door open when he brushed his teeth. He did not have a job at the moment. He was, as he explained to Wren one evening over a beer he had not paid for between things. He moved in without anyone asking Wren if it was all right. The first night he was there, he slept on the couch. The second night he was there, he slept on the couch. By the end of the second week, his clothes were in Brielle's closet, and his shoes were lined up by the door, and his shaving kit was on the back of the toilet, and the rent split that had been 2 ways was still 2 ways, except that the apartment was holding 3 people now, and the kitchen was holding 3 sets of dishes, in the small living room with its single couch and its single chair was holding a man who watched television and with the volume up and ate cereal at midnight, and did not contribute in any visible way to the maintenance of the household he had moved into. Brielle did not bring it up. Wren understood what that silence meant. She understood it the way she understood a wall that had begun to shift at the corner. A wall that has shifted at the corner is not a wall that has failed yet. It is a wall that is going to fail. The mortar in one joint has opened, and the load has redistributed, and every wagon that goes by on the road outside is now putting its weight onto a wall that has begun to bow, and the wall will hold for a while and then it will not. And the only question is whether you walk away before it comes down on you or after. Wren walked away. She did it on a Saturday morning in late March while Brielle and Wyatt were still asleep. She packed her duffel bag in her canvas rucksack. She took her 11 notebooks out of their wooden milk crate and wrapped them in a piece of canvas tarp and tied them with twine. She took her father's small block plane out of its felt sleeve and set it carefully in the bottom of the rucksack. She took the framed photograph of her father at his workbench, the one her mother had taken the Christmas before he got sick, in which Alden was holding a freshly finished cherry Windsor chair up to the workshop window to check its symmetry, his face in profile, his expression, the specific patient concentration of a man who has spent 11 years making chairs and who knows without needing to measure whether a leg is true. She wrapped the photograph in an old flannel shirt of her father's that she had kept. She put it on top of the duffel. She wrote a short note on the back of an envelope and left it on the kitchen table. The note said, "I'm out. The rent is yours. Take care of yourself, Brielle." She closed the apartment door behind her and walked down the gravel driveway of the school toward the road. She did not look back. There was no reason to. She knew what was behind her. The walking she had done with her father had taught her that. You do not need to turn around to see a thing you have already seen. She walked a half-mile down to the bus stop on Route 41. She bought a one-way ticket to Litchfield for $7 from the driver of the 11 o'clock bus. She sat near the back. She put her duffel between her knees. She set her rucksack on her lap with the milk crate of notebooks underneath. She rested her hand on the rucksack on the canvas where she could feel the hard shape of her father's block plane through the cloth. The bus pulled out of Salisbury at 11:15 and headed south through the hills. She watched the stone walls go by. She got off the bus in Litchfield at 20 minutes after 12. She walked from the bus station to the public library 3 blocks east with her duffel and her rucksack and her milk crate, and she went inside and sat down at one of the public computers in the back. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a clip, looked at the duffel bag and the milk crate and said nothing. Wren signed in. She opened the browser. She did not know what she was looking for. She knew only that she had $1,104 in the bank and $1.80 in her pocket and no place to sleep that night, and that she needed before sundown to find a roof. She typed in the search bar, cheap rentals, Litchfield County, Connecticut. She scrolled. The rents were $800 a month, $900 and $1,100. None of it was hers. She kept scrolling. After half an hour, she changed the search. She typed Litchfield County surplus property. She found it on the second page of results. The Litchfield County surplus property page was a plain government list. No photographs, no descriptions to speak of. It was the page where the county put parcels and structures it could not unload through any normal channel. Most of the listings were unbuildable lots. Some were old utility substations. One was a former animal control kennel. And at the bottom of the page, in a single line of text, was this: one-story fieldstone structure, approximately 144 square feet, on a 6/10 acre parcel of former turnpike right-of-way 4 miles north of Cornwall Bridge. Built 1802 by the Goshen Cornwall Turnpike Company. Decommissioned 1912. Asking price $1. Wren read the line. She read it again. She read it a third time. She did not move. She knew this building. She had been to this building. She had been outside this building. She had put her hand on the south wall of this building when she was 8 years old on a Sunday morning in October of 2011, and her father had told her that the wall would stand for 300 years if nobody pushed it over. She closed her eyes. She opened them. The line was still there. She got up from the computer. She walked to the front desk. She asked the gray-haired librarian for a piece of paper and a pen, and she wrote down the parcel number and the contact information for the Litchfield County Clerk's office. The librarian watched her write. The librarian did not ask any questions. Wren walked the 4 blocks to the county building. She arrived at the clerk's office at 2:20. The clerk was a man in his early 60s named Mr. Pemberton. He had a closely trimmed gray mustache and a brown wool cardigan and the unhurried manner of a man who had been at the same desk in the same office for a very long time and was not going to be rushed by anyone. He looked up when Wren came in. He took in the duffel bag and the milk crate and the canvas rucksack on her shoulder. He said, "Help you, miss." Wren put the slip of paper on the counter. She said, "I'd like to buy this." Mr. Pemberton picked up the paper. He looked at the parcel number. He set the paper down. He turned to the wooden file cabinet behind him and pulled open a drawer and walked his fingers through a row of folders until he found one. He brought the folder back to the counter. He opened it. He read for a moment. Then he looked up at Wren over the top of the folder. He said, "What's your name, miss?" She said, "Wren Calloway." Mr. Pemberton's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted a quarter of an inch. He set the folder down on the counter. He took off his reading glasses and folded them and laid them on top of the folder. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. He said, "Calloway, from down by Cornwall Bridge." She said, "Yes, sir." "Your father was Alden Calloway." She said, "Yes." Mr. Pemberton was quiet. He said, "I knew your father, Miss Calloway, not well, but I met him." She did not say anything. He said he came in here in the spring of 2013 to this same office. He sat where you're standing now. He asked about that same building. He wanted to buy it. Wren felt the floor of the clerk's office move under her very slightly, the way a foundation moves under a wall when a tree root finally pushes through the last of the packed earth and the corner begins almost imperceptibly to shift. She heard her own voice say, "He wanted to buy it. He did. Why didn't he?" The county wouldn't sell it to him. The structure was on the historical register at that time. The Historical Commission had concerns about liability. They were worried that if they sold it for nothing and it collapsed and somebody got hurt, the county would be on the hook. Mr. Pemberton paused. "Your father was disappointed, Miss Calloway. I remember that. He didn't make a scene. He just thanked me and put on his hat and walked out." He picked up his glasses. He put them back on. The Historical Commission gave up on the building in late 2013, took it off the register. After that, nobody at the county knew what to do with it. It sat in the surplus listings for the better part of 11 years. Nobody wanted it. The asking price came down $100 a year until it hit the floor. He looked at her. "I don't know why your father wanted it, Miss Calloway. He didn't say, but I have thought about it from time to time over the years." He turned the folder around so she could read the deed. He said, "Are you sure you want to buy this building?" Wren put her hand flat on the counter to steady herself. She said, "Yes, sir, I am." Mr. Pemberton nodded once. He took a pen out of the cup beside the register. He uncapped it. He set it down on the deed. He said, "Then sign here, Miss Calloway." She signed. She paid him $1 from her pocket. He took the $1. He went to the back of the office and unlocked a small wooden cabinet on the wall and brought out a heavy iron key on a length of hemp twine. The key was old. The twine was newer than the key, but not by much. He laid the key on the counter in front of her. He said, "It's a 4-mile walk from Cornwall Bridge, Miss Calloway." She said, "I know it is." She put the key in the front pocket of her rucksack. She picked up her duffel and her milk crate. She walked out of the county clerk's office into the cold gray afternoon of late March, and she went back to the bus station and she caught the 3:15 bus down through the hills to Cornwall Bridge. She got off in the village at 4 o'clock. She left her duffel and her milk crate at the post office with the postmistress who had known her mother for 23 years and who asked no questions and only said, "I'll keep them in the back, Wren. They'll be here when you come for them." She put her rucksack on her shoulder. She started walking north. The road out of Cornwall Bridge was paved for the first mile. Then it turned to dirt. Then at the end of the dirt road, it turned to an overgrown lane that had not been a road for 100 years, a lane that ran up into the hardwood forest between two coursed stone walls that her father had taught her to read when she was a child. She walked the 4 miles. The light was going by the time she got to the junction. The Tollhouse stood in the woods exactly where she had remembered it, 12 feet by 12 feet. Walls of coarse fieldstone 2 feet thick. A steep slate roof with 2 holes in it, a single chimney with the top 3 courses missing, an oak plank door nailed shut from the outside, a single small toll window facing the road. The northwest corner had shifted further than it had been when she had last seen it 10 years before. The young sugar maple that had been growing against the south wall in 2014 was no longer young. It was crowding the stone hard now, and one of the lower courses on the south face had bowed outward where the tree was pushing. The walls were standing, 222 years old and standing. Wren took the iron key out of her rucksack. She walked up to the door. She set the key in the rusted lock and turned it. The lock did not turn. The lock had not turned since 1912. She had not expected it to. She took out the small hammer she had at the Litchfield hardware store on her way to the bus, and she set the claw of it under the head of one of the rough nails in the door, and she pulled. The nail came out with a long, dry shriek. She pulled the next one. The next. She worked her way around the door frame in the failing light, prying nails one at a time, setting each one carefully on the stone sill of the toll window so as not to lose them. When the last nail was out, she set the hammer down. She put her hand on the oak plank door. She pushed. The door swung inward on its old hinges with a low sound like a C and led her into the dark interior of a stone building that no living person had been inside since the Goshen-Cornwall Turnpike had been formally decommissioned in October of 1912. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. She let her eyes adjust. The light from the toll window was dim and gray. The interior of the toll house was a single room. Stone walls, a stone floor, a stone fireplace on the west wall, a wooden shelf above the fireplace mantel, a wooden peg rack beside the door, a single small window. Nothing else, or so she thought. She stepped inside. She crossed slowly to the fireplace. She put her hand on the rough wood of the shelf above the mantel. She ran her fingers along it. Her fingertips found something. She looked down. In the fine layer of dust that had been settling on the shelf undisturbed for 112 years, lay a short wooden carpenter's pencil, the kind a furniture maker carries in the breast pocket of his work shirt and uses to mark a measurement on a board. The pencil had been sharpened with a knife the way her father had always sharpened his pencils. It had been worn down on one side from use. It was no longer than her thumb. She picked it up. She held it in her palm. She turned slowly and looked at the floor of the toll house in the gray light of the window. The dust on the stone floor was thick and old, but across the floor, leading from the door to the fireplace and back again, were the faint, mostly worn-away outlines of work boot prints. The prints were the size of a man's foot. They had been there a long time, but they had not been there for 112 years. Her father had been inside this building. He had stood where she was standing now. He had set his pencil on the shelf above the mantel. He had walked to the fireplace and back to the door more than once. Wren Calloway sank down onto the cold stone floor of the toll house and folded her arms across her knees and lowered her forehead to her arms and cried for the first time since the morning of her father's funeral in October of 2014, when she had been 11 years old, and the men from the funeral home had lowered the pine box into the cold ground of the small cemetery behind the White Clapper Church in Cornwall. The light went out of the toll window. The room went dark around her. She did not move. She held her father's pencil in her closed hand, and somewhere in the wall behind her, in a small niche cut into the coursed fieldstone between the inner and outer faces, sealed behind a single stone, whose mortar had been mixed softer than the mortar around it, on a day in October of 1912 by a man named Silas Hatcher. Two objects waited for her in the dark. They had been waiting for 112 years. They had been waiting, although she did not know it yet for her. She slept on the stone floor that first night. She had not planned to. She had planned to walk the 4 miles back to Cornwall Bridge in the dark and ask her mother for a bed and come back in the morning with the duffel bag and the milk crate of notebooks and begin under daylight the slow work of understanding what she had bought. But the dark came down fast in the woods of the Litchfield Hills in late March, and by the time she lifted her forehead from her arms, the toll window was a pale gray square against a wall of solid black, and the 4 miles of overgrown lane between her and the village was not a walk she was willing to make by feel. She stayed. She rolled out her canvas rucksack for a pillow. She wrapped herself in the old flannel shirt of her father's that had been wrapped around the framed photograph. She lay on her side on the cold stone floor, facing the fireplace, with her father's small carpenter's pencil closed in her fist against her chest. She did not sleep so much as she stopped moving. The building was cold. The building was silent. The building had been silent except for wind and rain and the slow, patient work of tree roots on its foundation for 112 years. It had learned silence the way a wall learns to stand. She listened to it breathe around her. She thought about her father standing in the same room. She thought about the pencil in her hand and the boot prints on the floor and the long private hours Alden Calloway had spent inside a building he had never once mentioned to his wife or his daughter. She thought about what he had been doing. She did not yet know. She did not yet have the shape of it. She had only the edge of the shape, the way a person running a hand along a wall in the dark will first feel not the full outline of an object, but only the rim of it, the smallest wrongness, the place where the wall stops being wall. She slept finally sometime after midnight. She woke in the first gray light of dawn, with her breath coming out of her mouth in a visible cloud. She sat up. She put her hand flat on the stone floor. The stone was so cold it burned the heel of her palm. She stood up slowly because her back had set overnight. She walked to the toll window and she looked out. The woods outside were the pale brown of late March in Connecticut, the bare branches of the hardwoods standing against a colorless sky, the old roadbed of the abandoned turnpike running away from the toll house in both directions under its cover of leaf mold and moss and frost. She walked back into Cornwall Bridge that morning. She was at the post office at 8. The postmistress, a woman named Mrs. Doriot, who had been the postmistress in Cornwall Bridge for 31 years, looked up from her sorting when Wren came through the door and took in the girl's face without comment. Mrs. Doriot said only, "Your things are in the back, Wren." Wren said, "Thank you. Your mother stopped in this morning. She wanted to know if I had seen you. I'll go see her." She did not seem worried. She seemed like a woman who was waiting. Wren nodded. She picked up her duffel and her milk crate of notebooks. She walked the 3 blocks to the small white house at the end of Elm Street, where Imogen Calloway had been living alone for the 10 years since Alden had died. The right-hand drive Jeep was in the driveway. The kitchen light was on. Imogen met her at the door and did not say anything at first and did not ask any questions. She only stepped back and held the door open and let her daughter come in with the duffel bag and the milk crate of notebooks and set them down on the kitchen floor. Imogen poured 2 cups of black coffee. She set one in front of Wren at the kitchen table. She sat down across from her daughter. She said, "Tell me," Wren told her. She told it flat. She told it without decoration. She told her mother about Brielle and about the boyfriend on the couch and about the bus to Litchfield and the public library and the line on the county surplus page and the walk to the clerk's office and the conversation with Mr. Pemberton. When she got to the part about her father coming into the clerk's office in the spring of 2013 and asking to buy the toll house, she stopped. She watched her mother's face. Imogen did not speak. Imogen sat with both hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on the wall above Wren's shoulder. And for a long time she did not move. Then she said in a voice that was very level and very quiet, "I didn't know that." "He never told you?" "No. He never told me either." Imogen looked at her daughter. She said, "What did you find in the building, Wren?" Wren reached into the front pocket of her rucksack. She brought out the short carpenter's pencil. She set it on the kitchen table between them. Imogen looked at the pencil. She did not pick it up. She sat looking at it for a long time. Then she lifted her coffee cup with both hands and drank from it slowly, and when she set it down again, she said, "That's his. I know the way he sharpened them. Nobody else sharpened them like that." Wren said, "He was inside, Mom. He was inside the building. There are boot prints on the floor. He had taken the nails out of the door at some point and put them back." "How many times?" "I don't know. More than once." Imogen closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, her face had not changed, but she said, "He used to come home on Saturday afternoons with sawdust on his jacket that wasn't cherry sawdust. I couldn't tell what it was. I thought he was working on something for somebody, and not wanting to talk about it. He got quiet about his work sometimes. She looked at Ren. She said, "You're going to go back to that building." "Yes." "You're going to live there." "Yes." Imogen was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand flat over her daughter's hand, which was resting on the table next to the pencil. She left it there for the base of a long, slow breath, and then she took it away. She said, "Let me drive you up with the Jeep. You can't carry all of that on foot." That was how the Tollhouse became her home. Imogen drove her up that afternoon in the right-hand drive Jeep, the two of them sitting in the wrong seats from the American point of view. Ren in the left seat, where she had sat as a child on the mail route, and Imogen on the right with her hands on the unfamiliar wheel. They drove as far as the Jeep could go up the overgrown lane, which was less than a mile, and then they carried the duffel and the milk crate and a kerosene lantern and a bag of canned food and 4 wool blankets in an old cast-iron camp stove on foot for the rest of the way. Imogen stood in the doorway of the Tollhouse when they had finished bringing the last of the things in. She looked around the single stone room in the gray afternoon light. She did not go in. She said, "Ren, I'm going to come back in 3 days with more things. I'm going to bring you what I've got. You are not going to freeze in here." "Okay, Mom. You call me if anything changes." "I will." Imogen stood in the doorway a moment longer. She said, "Your father would have been so angry he didn't find it first." Then she walked back down the overgrown lane to the Jeep. Ren stood in the doorway and watched her go. That was a Monday. On Wednesday, she found the soft joint. She had spent the first 2 days doing what a person does when she moves into a place she has never lived. She had swept the stone floor with an old corn broom her mother had sent up. She had set the cast-iron camp stove on the hearth of the big stone fireplace and run its small stovepipe up into the flue and lit it for the first time and watched the smoke draw cleanly up through a chimney that had not drawn smoke since 1912. She had unrolled a canvas cot next to the fireplace and laid the 4 wool blankets on it. She had set the framed photograph of her father at his workbench on the wooden shelf above the mantel next to the short carpenter's pencil, and she had leaned her father's block plane against the photograph. On Wednesday afternoon, in the first good light of a clear, cold day, she began the thing she had come to the Tollhouse to do. She began to read the walls. She started at the door, and she worked her way around the room the way her father had taught her, to work a wall slowly with both hands, feeling every joint in the coursed fieldstone with her fingertips. North wall, east wall, south wall, west wall. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was only paying attention the way he had taught her to pay attention. The mortar in the walls was the color of old bone, exactly as she remembered from the day she was 8 years old, and he had put her hand on the south face of the same building. The mortar was hard, the mortar was smooth, joint after joint after joint, all of them the same. And then on the west wall, beside the fireplace, about 3 feet above the floor, her fingertip caught. She stopped. She went back. She ran her finger along the joint again. The mortar in this joint was different. It was not crumbling. It was not failing. It was only slightly softer than the mortar in the joints around it. Not bone, chalk. The consistency of a piece of blackboard chalk, where the rest of the wall was the consistency of a beach stone worn smooth by 100 years of tide. And the stone above the joint she saw now that she was looking for, it was slightly smaller than the stones around it. Not much, half an inch maybe, fitted into a space that had originally held a larger stone. Ren pressed her fingertip into the mortar. It gave very slightly. She sat back on her heels on the cold stone floor in front of the west wall. She understood what she was looking at. Her father had taught her when she was 8 years old that in a wall full of hard mortar, one soft joint was not a flaw. It was a message. It was someone speaking to her across the years, the only way a mason can speak across years, which is by mixing his mortar a little wetter on one single day and laying one single stone into one single joint and letting the ages find whoever was going to find it. She did not move for a long time. Then she got up and she went to the rucksack on the cot and she took out the cold chisel she had carried up from Cornwall Bridge, and an old chisel of her father's from the roll of tools she had kept out of his workshop. She went back to the west wall. She fitted the edge of the chisel into the soft joint along the top of the small fieldstone. She tapped it lightly with the heel of her hand. The old dry mortar came away in thin strips the way mortar will when a wetter mix has been sealing a joint under a harder mix for a long time. She worked the chisel around the top of the stone, then the right side, then the bottom, then the left side. She did not hurry. She had spent her childhood on Sundays in the woods with a father who did not hurry. She worked the chisel around the small stone the way he had worked his hand plane across a piece of cherry, stroke by stroke, until she could feel the stone come loose in its seat. She set the chisel aside. She gripped the stone in both hands. She pulled. The stone came out of the wall. Behind it, in a small niche cut into the wall between the inner and outer courses of fieldstone, a space perhaps 12 inches wide and 10 inches high and 6 inches deep, lay two objects. Wren did not move. She sat on her heels on the stone floor of the Tollhouse with the loose fieldstone in her hands, and she looked into the niche, and she did not reach into it for a long time. The first object was an iron box. It was about the size of a loaf of bread. It was hand-forged, the iron dark with age, but not rusted through because the stone niche had kept it dry for 112 years. It had a narrow coin slot in the top. It had a hinged lid. It had a small padlock, hasp, empty, the padlock long gone. It was heavy, she would learn, when she lifted it heavier than it had any right to be, maybe 15 pounds of forged iron that a man had once leaned out of the toll window of this building to collect a penny from every wagon and every stagecoach and every drover's herd that had come up the Goshen-Cornwall Turnpike from the time the building was finished in 1802 to the afternoon of October 14, 1912, when the turnpike had been decommissioned by the state of Connecticut and the building had ceased forever to be a toll station. The second object was a rolled piece of heavy linen tied with a flat leather cord. Wren set the loose fieldstone on the floor beside her. She reached into the niche. She took out the iron box first. It was heavier than she expected. She set it on the stone floor in front of her. She reached back in and took out the roll of linen. She untied the leather cord. She unrolled the linen carefully on the stone floor beside the iron box. It was a hand-drawn survey map of the Goshen-Cornwall Turnpike. It had been inked on linen in a careful draughtsman's hand. The cartography was exact. The road ran in black ink across the linen from the north end, where it began at a junction outside the village of Goshen, to the south end where it crossed the Housatonic River at Cornwall Bridge. Every curve was drawn, every grade was noted, every bridge was marked. Every toll gate was shown with a small square. Every milestone was shown as a small numbered circle along the route. There were 11 of them. Each one was labeled with its distance from Goshen in neat, hand-lettered numerals. At the bottom of the map in the corner was a date and a signature. The date was 1803. The signature was a name. She did not know the name of the surveyor the Goshen-Cornwall Turnpike Company had hired to lay out the route 1 year after the toll house had been built. The map was 221 years old. It had been rolled up inside the wall of the toll house since October of 1912. Wren pressed her palms flat against the stone floor on either side of the map and lowered her head and closed her eyes. The iron box was still sitting on the floor beside the map. She opened her eyes. She reached for it. The hinged lid was not locked. The padlock was gone, the hasp empty. She lifted the lid. Inside the box, lying on the bottom, was a single folded letter. The paper was heavy, the linen rag paper they had still been making in small batches in New England mills at the beginning of the 20th century. The folds were sharp. The ink was still dark. She took the letter out and unfolded it carefully on her knee. It was written in the hand of a man who had spent 40 years writing in a ledger. It was dated October 14th, 1912. It began, "To whoever opens this wall." Wren read the letter once. Then she read it again. The writer was a man named Silas Hatcher. He had been the toll keeper at this gate from the spring of 1871 until the afternoon he was writing the letter. He was 63 years old. The next morning, the Goshen-Cornwall Turnpike would be formally decommissioned by the state of Connecticut, and the toll house would cease to be a toll station and would become, he supposed, a small stone building in the woods that nobody had any further use for. He was sealing the iron box and the linen survey map into the niche in the west wall because he could not hand them over to the company's agents, who would melt the box for scrap and file the map in a drawer in Hartford, where no one would ever look at it again. The box had been in the window of this building for 80 years. The map had been on the inside wall of this building for 109. They belonged, he wrote to the building. They did not belong to any company. He had turned in the last day's fares to the company treasurer that afternoon. The box was empty. There was no money in the wall. What was in the wall was the box itself, the iron, the coin slot, the hinge, the hasp. The box Silas Hatcher had written was the trade. A toll keeper without his box was a man standing beside a road with no authority to stop anyone. And the map showed every milestone on the turnpike. There were 11 milestones. He had walked the turnpike from end to end, he wrote, once every spring for 41 years, checking the milestones and reporting their condition to the company. He expected that after tomorrow, no one would check them again. He did not know who would find the as he wrote. He hoped it would be a person who understood stone. A person who understood stone would have noticed that the mortar around one particular fieldstone on the west wall was softer than the mortar around the others. That person would know what soft mortar meant in a wall of hard mortar. It meant someone had been there after the wall was built and had left something behind. Keep the box, he had written. Find the milestones. The letter was signed in the careful hand of a man who did not waste emotion. Silas Hatcher, toll keeper. October 14th, 1912. Wren did not cry. She had cried in this room 2 nights before, and the crying had been for her father, and she did not have another one in her for anybody else. But she folded the letter along its original folds very carefully, and she put it back inside the iron box, and she closed the lid. She picked up the vase and carried it across the room and set it on the wooden shelf above the fireplace mantel next to the framed photograph of her father and the short carpenter's pencil. She rolled up the linen map and she set it on the shelf beside the iron box. She went back to the west wall. She picked up the loose fieldstone. She carried it over and she leaned it for now against the stones of the hearth. She walked to the oak plank door. She opened it. She stepped out of the toll house into the cold gray afternoon of the Litchfield Hills in late March. She stood there for a long time. The wind moved in the bare branches of the hardwoods. She said aloud to the empty woods, "All right, Mr. Hatcher." She went back inside. She took an oil lamp down from the shelf and a legal pad out of the rucksack and a pencil, and she sat down on her cot in front of the stove with the linen survey map spread out on her knees, and she began, in the dim light of the oil lamp as the afternoon faded into evening, to copy the positions of the 11 milestones by hand, each one onto its own page of the legal pad with notes about the distance from Goshen and the distance from the nearest stone wall corner and the distance from the nearest bridge crossing and any landmark that might have still been there in 1803 that might still be there in 2024. She worked until the light was gone. She worked by the light of the oil lamp until her eyes burned. She worked until she could not work any longer, and then she set the map down, and she blew out the lamp, and she lay down on the cot in the dark, and she slept the sleep of a person who has understood for the first time what she has been put on a road to do. She did the first walk on Saturday. She walked south out of the toll house along the overgrown lane with the linen map rolled up under her arm, in a waterproof tube, in the legal pad in her rucksack, and her father's chisel in her belt. She walked for 200 yards. She stopped. She turned. She looked at the east side of the lane. The map said the first milestone south of the toll house, milestone number 7, counting from the north end of the turnpike, was 200 yards out on the east side of the road, set back 3 feet from the center line of the original road surface. There was no milestone visible. There was only a field of leaf mold and the trunks of young birches and a low mossy hummock about the right size and shape. She walked to the hummock. She knelt down. She pushed the leaf mold aside with her bare hands. The top of a granite post rose up through the moss, and the duff tilted 45 degrees, the original road-facing side now almost buried in the leaf pack. She brushed the moss off with her fingers. She saw carved into the granite the deeply cut numeral 7. She sat back on her heels in the cold forest loam. She did not speak for a long time. Then she took the chisel out of her belt, and she began very carefully to dig away the centuries of leaf mold and packed earth from around the base of the milestone. It took her the rest of the afternoon. She worked on her knees. She cleared the stone on all 4 sides down to the bedrock of its footing, and she could see when she had cleared it that the stone had not fallen because it had been knocked over. It had fallen because the foot of it had worked loose in its bed across 100 years of frost heave and ground shift, and it had canted over but not broken, and it was still joined barely to the old stone footing Silas Hatcher's predecessor had set for it in 1803. She lifted the top of the stone with both hands. It was heavy. She was small. But she had been hauling cinder blocks on the grounds crew at the school in Salisbury for 3 years, and she knew how to lift with her legs, and she got the top of the milestone up out of the leaf mold, and she braced it on her thigh, and she walked it inch by inch back up to vertical. She held it there. She packed earth and stones around the base with her free hands, scraping the earth in from the forest floor around her, tamping it with the butt end of the chisel. She set small wedge stones along the buried base of the post to stabilize it. She straightened up slowly and stepped back. The milestone stood. It stood for the first time in decades exactly as it had been set in 1803, with the carved numeral 7 facing the road that no one drove on anymore, in the cold gray light of a Saturday afternoon in late March of 2024. Wren stood in front of the milestone. She said aloud, 1. Then she walked back down the length of the post and knelt in the leaf mold and brushed the last of the dirt off the bottom corner of the stone, the part that had been buried in the ground all those years, the part you could only see if you had lifted the stone and tipped it and stood it back up and then bent down to look at it. There, carved into the granite on the buried corner, in small, neat, chiseled letters, no larger than her thumbnail, were 3 marks. A period, a letter, a period, then a second letter, then a period, then a 4-digit year, a C 2013. Wren Calloway went down onto her hands and knees on the forest floor in front of milestone 7 of the Goshen Cornwall Turnpike, and she lowered her forehead onto the cold granite of the buried corner of the stone, and she stayed that way for a long time with her eyes closed and her palms flat in the leaf mold on either side of the stone, and the late afternoon light failing in the woods around her. Her father had been here. Her father had come to this milestone. Her father had, at some point in the final year of his life, when he already knew he was dying, replaced this milestone, or repaired it, or carved the bottom of it fresh and reset it with his own hands. She would not know exactly until she had looked at it more carefully, but what she knew there with her forehead against the granite was that her father had not been teaching her on those Sunday walks how to read stone. Her father had not been teaching her a skill. He had been teaching her a trade, and he had been, in the last year of his life, practicing it himself alone quietly, without mentioning it to his wife or his daughter, for reasons that she did not yet understand, but that she was milestone by milestone going to understand. Alden Calloway had picked up where Silas Hatcher had left off. 101 years apart, 2 men had walked the same 11-mile road and had counted the same 11 milestones and had set their hands on the same stones. And her father had carved his initials into the bottom of milestone 7 in the year of the carving, and he had reset the stone in the forest floor, and he had gone home that evening with sawdust on his jacket that was not cherry sawdust, because it was granite dust and lime dust and the dust of the old forest duff. And his wife had noticed it and had said nothing because her husband was dying and she was not going to take away from him whatever the thing was that he needed to do in his last months. And he had done it and he had finished it, and then he had died and he had not told anyone. Not his wife, not his daughter. He had told no one. He had carved his initials into the buried bottom of the stone where only the next person to lift the stone would ever see them, and he had trusted that the next person to lift the stone would be his daughter. He had been right. Wren raised her head from the milestone. She sat back on her heels. She wiped her face on the sleeve of her jacket. She did not cry. She did not have anything to cry. What she had was something else, something large and slow and without shape yet. She set her fingers lightly on the carved letters AC 2013, and she traced them with her fingertip the way she had traced the mortar joint in the south wall of this building when she was 8 years old. She said quietly, "All right, Dad." She got up. She walked back to the toll house in the last of the gray light. The iron box was on the wooden shelf over the mantel. The linen map was beside it. The loose fieldstone from the west wall was leaning against the hearth. The photograph of her father at his workbench was propped up against the stones of the fireplace. She did not cook supper. She sat on the stone floor in front of the fireplace, and she fed small sticks into the iron stove, and she opened the legal pad to the second page, the page she had prepared for milestone number 7, and she wrote across the top of it in her own hand in pencil, Milestone 7, upright, reset, ACE 2013. Then she wrote underneath, after a long pause, AC equals Alden Calloway. Then she set the legal pad beside her on the stone floor, and she leaned her back against the cold fieldstone wall beside the fireplace. And she closed her eyes, and she stayed that way for a long time, while the stove made small, warm sounds and the wind moved in the hardwood forest outside the toll window. She did not know yet about the second letter. She did not know yet about the hollow stone in the chimney. She did not know yet about the 11 notebooks of her father's that were waiting under the third floorboard of the old chicken coop workshop behind the cottage at the end of the dirt lane outside the village of Cornwall Bridge. She knew only what the wall had taught her, which was what her father had taught her when she was 8 years old on a Sunday morning in October of 2011. In a wall full of hard mortar, a single soft joint is a message. The message is always the same. Someone was here, and someone left something behind, and the wall has been holding it ever since. The winter came down hard that year. She had been ready for it in the way a person can be ready for a thing she has never done, which is to say she had read about it, and she had thought about it, and she had laid in what a person lays in when she has only a stone room 12 feet square to keep herself alive inside of for 5 months. Her mother had brought up 2 more loads of supplies across April and May in the right-hand drive Jeep, a heavier canvas cot, a down sleeping bag rated to -10, a small hand-cranked radio, 4 cords of seasoned hardwood that Imogen had paid a neighbor to deliver to the end of the lane, which Wren had then carried by wheelbarrow load by load, the quarter-mile up through the woods to the toll house and stacked under a tarp against the south wall. She had found 7 more milestones across the spring and summer and early fall of 2024. Milestone 6, about a mile north of the toll house on the east side of the lane, tilted but not fallen reset by Wren on a Saturday afternoon in April, with her bare hands and her father's chisel in a pile of wedge stones from the forest floor. Milestone 5, a mile further north, lying flat under a foot of leaf mold rolled over on its face. Milestone 4. Milestone 8, working south from the toll house, this time on the west side of the lane, still upright but leaning. Milestones 10 and 11, both of them at the southern end of the turnpike near the Housatonic Crossing. Both of them still standing on the shoulders of what had become a paved town road, both of them in good enough condition that she did not need to do anything except clear the brush away from their bases and write their coordinates in her legal pad and move on. And Milestone 2. Every one of them she checked as she had checked Milestone 7 for the small carved letters in the 4-digit year on the buried corner. Milestone 7 was the only one. That was the one her father had chosen. She understood by midsummer that he had picked it because it was the only one of the 11 milestones that had actually fallen, had actually broken at the footing, had actually needed to be replaced rather than simply straightened. The others were old stones that had tilted or sunk or leaned in the way a 200-year-old granite post will in the freeze and thaw of a Connecticut forest floor. But milestone 7 had broken at the bottom, and its top section had been too damaged to reset, and her father in the spring of 2013 had cut a new post from the bottom half of the old stone, carved the number 7 fresh into its face, marked the buried corner with his initials and the year, and set it back into the footing. He had done the work of a man who intended to leave a thing standing. She kept finding his hand in small ways after that. A new wedge stone in the base of milestone 6, hand-worked lime, mortared to the footing, not from 1803, a cleaned and regrooved number on the face of milestone 4, a replacement steel pin set into the footing of milestone 11. He had not been able in the last year of his life to walk the whole turnpike. He had done what he had strength to do. He had fixed what he could fix and had left the rest for whoever came next. He had left the rest for her. She knew this now. She was working through his list. She had not found milestones 1, 3, or 9. The weather closed down on her in November. It snowed on the 15th, a wet early snow that came and went. It snowed again on the 29th, and that one stayed. The temperatures dropped in the first week of December and did not come back up. She had banked the north wall of the Tollhouse with split stove wood and a layer of spruce boughs she had cut from a blowdown, and she had sealed the 2 holes in the slate roof with galvanized flashing from the Litchfield hardware store and roofing tar she had melted in a coffee can on the iron stove. She had a little wire mesh damper on the old stovepipe that she could work with a pair of long-handled pliers. She had her down bag on the cot and 4 wool blankets folded under it. She could keep the room at about 55 degrees when the weather outside was in the low 20s. When the weather outside went below 10, the walls took the cold and gave it back to her, and she wore her down coat inside and pulled her wool hat down to her eyebrows and did her reading and her sketching at the small fold-up table she had set up in front of the stove. On the night of January 14, 2025, the weather went to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. A storm had been building since morning. She had listened to it on the hand-cranked radio sitting on her cot with her legs folded up under her, cranking the little handle every few minutes to keep the signal alive. The Weather Service was calling it a nor'easter moving up the coast faster than the forecast, and the Litchfield Hills were going to be in the bullseye. By 4 in the afternoon, the sky outside the toll window had gone the color of iron, and by 6, the snow had started, and by 8, the wind had picked up and begun to throw the snow horizontally across the clearing in front of the building, and she had banked the stove as high as she could bank it and gone to bed in her down coat and her wool hat and both pairs of her wool socks. She woke at 2 in the morning to a sound she did not recognize. It was not the wind. The wind had been in her ears for 6 hours, and she had learned its voice. It was a dry grinding sound. It was coming from above her, from the roof, from the chimney. It was the sound of stone on stone. She came up out of the sleeping bag and turned on her headlamp. The room was full of a fine gray dust. The dust was coming down out of the flue of the fireplace. It was settling on the stone floor in front of the hearth in a pale pyramid. The chimney was shedding from the inside. She scrambled up off the cot and grabbed her down coat and pulled her boots on over her wool socks and ran to the oak door and wrenched it open into the storm. The wind took the door out of her hand and slammed it back against the stone wall. She stepped outside with her headlamp. The snow was horizontal. She could see maybe 6 feet in front of her face. She turned and pointed the headlamp up at the chimney. The top 3 courses of the chimney. The one Silas Hatcher's letter had not mentioned because they had already been missing in 1912. The ones that had stood at a partial height for more than 100 years were gone. And the next 3 courses below them were gone too, and the course below that one had split along the mortar joint, and half of it was dangling over the edge ready to fall. The wind was working on the remaining stones. She could hear them grinding. The chimney was coming down. If the chimney came all the way down, it would come down through the roof. If it came down through the roof, the building would be open to the storm. If the building was open to the storm, the fire in the stove would die, and the temperature inside would drop to minus 15 within an hour, and she would freeze to death on the cot. She stood in the doorway of the Tollhouse at 2 o'clock in the morning on January 15th, 2025, in a nor'easter with the wind coming down at 50 miles an hour and the snow blowing horizontal through the beam of her headlamp, and she understood that her life was going to depend on what she did in the next 20 minutes. She went back inside. She put on her work gloves. She pulled a wool balaclava down over her face. She wrapped a length of rope around her waist and tied the other end to the latch of the oak door so that if she lost her footing on the roof and fell, she would not go all the way off the eaves into the snow. She took the canvas tarp off the woodpile and folded it small and tucked it under her arm. She took a bucket of lime mortar she had mixed 3 weeks before and had been keeping from freezing by wrapping it in wool blankets next to the stove, and she took a trowel and a pointing tool and a short-handled mason's hammer and a handful of wedge stones from a small pile she had been saving against the north wall. She climbed up onto the roof. She climbed with the rope around her waist and her tools in a canvas bucket tied to her belt, up the north wall of the toll house on a wooden ladder she had leaned against the eaves that afternoon for another reason entirely and had providentially not taken down. The wind tried to take her off the ladder twice. She leaned into it. She got up onto the slates of the north-facing roof slope on her belly, and she crawled up the slope toward the chimney with her gloves scraping on the slate and her headlamp throwing a small cone of light into the blowing snow. She did not think about her father. She did not think about Silas Hatcher. She thought about the next handhold, and about the wind, and about the dangling stone on the south side of the chimney that was going to come down any minute and take the next 3 courses with it if she did not get to it first. She got to it. She reached up with one gloved hand and caught the dangling stone before the wind took it, and she set it carefully down on the slope of the roof between her chest and her knees. She took the mason's hammer from the canvas bucket. She knocked the broken lip of mortar off the top of the next intact course. She spread a thin bed of lime mortar with the trowel. She set the dangling stone back into its original seat. She held it in place with one gloved hand. She worked a wedge stone into the back of the joint with the other hand. She pointed the face of the joint with the trowel. She held the stone until she could count to 50. She let go. The stone held. The wind pulled at the stone. The stone held. She did the next stone. She did the stone after that. She worked for 40 minutes on the roof of the toll house in a -15-degree nor'easter by the light of a headlamp, with the rope around her waist and her hands numb inside her gloves and the cold coming in through her balaclava. And she rebuilt 3 courses of chimney stone with her father's chisel and a bucket of lime mortar and the wedge stones she had been saving without knowing what she had been saving them for. When she could not feel her hands anymore, she stopped. She crawled back down the slope. She got back onto the ladder. She got down off the ladder. She got back inside the toll house, and she shut the door behind her, and she leaned against the inside of the door with her gloved hand pressed flat against the oak, and she shook for a long time. The chimney held through the rest of the storm. It held for the rest of the winter. It was holding still. She slept for 14 hours the day after the storm. She woke at 4 in the afternoon of January 16th with her hands aching and her face raw from the cold and the pale blue light of a clear afternoon coming in through the toll window, and the air inside the building at a steady 60 degrees because the stove had been running the whole time and the roof was sealed and the chimney was drawing clean. She made herself a pot of tea on the iron stove. She drank it slowly, sitting on her cot with her back against the stone wall, looking across the room at the fireplace and the wooden shelf above the mantel and the iron box of Silas Hatcher's sitting on the shelf beside the framed photograph of her father at his workbench. She thought about the courses of chimney stone she had set in the dark. She thought about the lime mortar mix 3 weeks before that had held them. She thought about how she had known, without having to think about it, how to set a stone into a wet bed of lime on a night when she could not feel her own hands. She got up off the cot. She walked across the room to the fireplace. She stood in front of the fireplace for a long time with her teacup in her hand, and she looked up at the stones of the chimney breast where it rose from the mantel shelf to the ceiling. She set her teacup down on the shelf. She took her father's chisel off the mantel. She ran the tip of the chisel along the lower courses of the chimney breast, along the mortar joints, joint by joint, reading them with the steel, the way she had once read them with her fingertip. She did not know what she was looking for. She did not know yet that she was looking for anything at all. She was working on instinct, the way a woman who has read a wall for a living will run her hand over a wall one more time after she thinks she is finished, because the wall is not finished with her. 3 feet up the chimney breast on the left side of the fire opening, the chisel caught. The mortar in that joint was a shade softer than the mortar around it. Not chalk, not bone either. Something in between. Wren went very still. She set the chisel down on the mantel. She reached up with her fingertips and she pressed lightly on the joint. The joint gave minutely. She picked up the chisel. She fitted the edge into the soft joint. She tapped it lightly with the heel of her hand. Mortar came away in thin, dry strips. She worked the chisel around the stone top, right side bottom, left side, working more quickly than she had worked on the west wall, because she knew now what she was looking for, and because her father had taught her on Sunday mornings in her childhood that when the wall is ready to give a thing up, you do not hesitate. The stone came loose. She pulled it out of the chimney breast. Behind it, in a small niche the size of a cigar box cut into the stonework between the flue and the fireplace, lay an object wrapped in a piece of oiled canvas. She set the loose stone on the mantel. She reached into the niche with both hands. She took the wrapped object out. She carried it over to the cot. She sat down. She set the object on her knees. The canvas was oiled the way her father had oiled his own tool rolls, with linseed oil worked into the cloth by hand. The knot at the top was the specific knot her father had used, a simple double overhand he had tied with the same half turn every time, the knot he had tied on his plane rolls and his chisel rolls and the small canvas pouch he had kept his carpenter's pencils in. She untied the knot. She unrolled the canvas. Inside was a letter folded twice in a small iron key. The letter was written on the same kind of heavy paper her father had used for his furniture invoices. It was in his handwriting. It was dated March 18th, 2013. It began Wren. She read it once all the way through without stopping. Then she folded it closed on her knee, and she sat with both her hands flat on the folded letter, and she looked across the room at the cold stone wall of the Tollhouse, and she did not move for a long time. The letter said, "Wren, if you are reading this, you found the Tollhouse by yourself and you went inside and you read the west wall. That means you did what I could not ask you to do. I am sorry I could not ask you. There was not enough time left to ask you, and there were things I wanted you to find on your own, because finding them yourself was the whole point of them. The Tollhouse has been in the county's surplus list for as long as I have known about it. I came to the clerk's office in Litchfield in the spring of this year, and I asked to buy it. I offered $100. They would not sell it to me. They told me the Historical Commission still had it on the register, and they were not selling it to anyone. I told them I did not have the time to wait them out. I did not say why. I think they thought I was not well in the head. Maybe I wasn't. I walked out. I drove home. I did not tell your mother. I had been going into that building for 2 years. I pried the nails out of the door. In 2011, the October after I took you there with me on the Sunday walk. I wanted to see the inside of a place I had been looking at from the outside for 40 years. I read the walls. I found the soft joint on the west wall. I took the stone out. I found Silas Hatcher's iron box and his linen map and his letter. I read his letter. I read the part where he asked whoever found the wall to keep the box and find the milestones. I put the box back. I put the map back. I put the stone back into the joint, and I remortared it with the softest mix I could make, because the box and the map did not belong to me. They belonged to the person Hatcher had been writing to. He was not writing to me. I had not earned that letter. I had only opened his wall. I thought about it for a year. In the spring of 2012, I started walking the turnpike. I walked it end to end 11 miles the way Hatcher wrote that he had walked it every spring for 41 years. I counted the milestones. 9 of them were still there in some condition or another. Milestones 3 and 9 were gone. I think they were pulled out in the 20s when they paved the southern end of the road. Milestone 7 was broken at the footing. The top piece had fallen and cracked. That was the one I could do something about. The others only needed to be straightened, and I left that work for whoever came next. In the spring of 2013, I cut a new piece of granite from the bottom half of the old Milestone 7. I carved the number fresh. I set the new stone in the old footing with lime mortar I mixed myself. I carved my initials and the year into the buried corner of the stone where only the next person to lift it would see them. I did not know for certain who the next person would be. I hoped it would be you. I did not tell you Wren because I wanted you to find it the way I had found what Hatcher left. I wanted you to be the kind of person who finds these things. You already were. I just did not want to spoil the walking for you. There are 11 notebooks under the floor of the workshop behind the cottage. They are under the third floorboard, the one with the knot near the door. Your mother does not know about them. They are the record of my walks on the turnpike between 2012 and 2013, the way your 11 notebooks are the record of your walks in the hills. Read them if you want to. Do not read them if you do not want to. They do not change anything. They are only another man's notes on the same stones. The key in this letter opens the old tin trunk in the corner of the workshop. There is nothing important in the trunk. There is only one thing I wanted you to have, which is the leather roll of my mason's tools. I never told you I had them. They were my father's. He did stonework for the state of Connecticut in the 1950s. He taught me to read stone. I taught you. The tools are good tools. They will cut granite if you take care of them. Find the last 2 milestones, Wren. Or if you cannot find them, make them. Stone does not have to be old to be true. It has to be set by a hand that knows why. I love you, Dad. Wren sat for a long time with the letter folded on her knee. She held a small iron key in her closed fist in her lap, the way she had held his carpenter's pencil in her closed fist on the first night she had slept on the stone floor of this building 10 months before. She did not cry. She had cried for her father on the first night. She had cried over Milestone 7 in the forest loam in March. There was no more crying left for him because the man had spent his last year making sure that she would not need to cry for him because he had spent his last year making sure that she would find him again and again and again in the walls he had set his hand to. She got up off the cot. She went back to the fireplace. She picked up the loose stone from the mantel. She carried it back to the chimney breast. She fitted it back into the niche. She did not remortar it. She was going to leave that joint open now. There was nothing left in the niche that needed to be hidden. She walked outside. The sun was going down low and red through the bare branches of the hardwood forest west of the Tollhouse. The snow from the nor'easter was crusted on top and blue in the shadows. The air was still. The storm had blown itself out, and the sky was the deep, cold, clear blue of a January afternoon in the Litchfield Hills after a front has gone through. She stood in the clearing in front of the Tollhouse with her father's letter folded in her coat pocket and his key in her closed hand. She said aloud to the woods, "All right, Dad." She walked the 4 miles down to Cornwall Bridge the next morning. She told her mother everything. She showed her the letter at the kitchen table. She watched Imogen read it through twice, very slowly in the yellow light of the kitchen lamp. When Imogen was done reading, she set the letter flat on the table. She put both her hands on the letter palms down, and she looked at her daughter across the table, and her face had not changed, but there was something in it that Wren had not seen since the morning of the funeral. Imogen said Saturdays. Wren said, "Yes, Mom. He always said he was going to the doctor." "I know. For a whole year." "Yes." Imogen took her hands off the letter. She got up from the table. She walked across the kitchen and picked up her coat from the peg by the back door. She said, "Let's go look at the workshop." They walked out across the side yard together in the cold January morning, the grass stiff with frost under their boots. The converted chicken coop was where it had always been set on its low foundation of fieldstones Alden had laid himself in 1998. The workbench was still in it. The leather tool roll of hand planes was still in the corner, where Imogen had never touched anything. The smell of cherry sawdust was still in the board's faint now, after 11 years, but still there the way a smell will stay in a building whose boards have known a thing for long enough. Wren knelt down in front of the door. She counted in from the threshold: first floorboard, second floorboard, third floorboard. The third floorboard had a dark knot near the door end about the size of a silver dollar. She worked the end of her father's chisel into the gap between the floorboards. She lifted. The floorboard came up. Under the floorboard, in the shallow cavity between the floor joists and the packed earth of the crawl space, wrapped in a length of the same oiled canvas from the Tollhouse, lay a stack of 11 small leather-bound notebooks. Wren sat back on her heels. Imogen stood in the doorway of the workshop with the cold morning light behind her, and she did not come in. Wren lifted the notebooks out. She set them on the workbench. She unwrapped the canvas. The leather covers were soft and dark. The pages inside were filled with her father's careful draftsman's hand. Elevation drawings of stone walls, diagrams of mortar joints, sketched plans of milestone footings, pencil notes in the margins about frost heave and stone condition in the distances between the 11 posts of the Goshen Cornwall Turnpike. Each notebook was dated on the inside front cover in his handwriting. March 2012, April 2012, May 2012, on and on through the seasons of 2012 and into the spring of 2013 to the last notebook, which ended in June of 2013, 4 months before he had gone into the clinic for the first set of tests and 16 months before he had died. He had walked the turnpike every weekend of the last 14 months of his health. He had drawn every stone. Wren opened the first notebook, flipped slowly through it. She opened the second, the third. They were line for line and drawing for drawing, the same as her own 11 notebooks at home in her duffel bag in the Tollhouse. Different hand, same work. She did not speak. Imogen came a step into the workshop finally and looked at the open notebook on the workbench. She said very quietly, "He used to come in on Saturday evenings and he would not say where he had been. I'd ask him and he'd say walking. That was all. I thought he was going to the clinic and not wanting to worry me. That is what I thought for the last year of his life. I thought he was sitting in a waiting room somewhere and not telling me." She put her hand on the edge of the workbench to steady herself. She said, "He was out walking the road, Wren, the whole year. He was out there with a pencil and a piece of paper doing the same thing you were doing, and neither of you ever knew." Wren closed the notebook. She came over to her mother. For the first time since the morning of the funeral in October of 2014, Wren put her arms around Imogen, and Imogen put her arms around Wren, and they stood together in the doorway of the workshop in the cold January light for a long time without either of them saying anything. Then Imogen stepped back. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She said, "Take the notebooks, Wren. They are yours." She said, "Finish the work." Wren spent the rest of the winter and the whole of 2025 and most of 2026 walking the turnpike. She found milestone 1 in the spring of 2025 up at the northern terminus near Goshen, where a retired road crew foreman from the county had remembered a granite post lying in his father's woodlot since the 1960s. He gave it back to her. She set it upright in its original footing. She did not find milestone 3. She did not find milestone 9. She walked the full length of the turnpike twice more that year, once in the spring and once in the fall. She walked it the way Silas Hatcher had walked it. She walked it the way her father had walked it. She found traces of where the footings had been at both missing sites. She found pieces of the original stones broken small in the drainage ditch beside the paved portion of the route south of Cornwall Bridge. There was not enough of either stone left to reset. In the spring of 2027, when she was 24 years old, she opened the last of her father's notebooks. On the back inside cover, on a page that had been blank the first time she had looked through the notebook 2 years before she had missed a faint pencil drawing. She had missed it because it was drawn very lightly, almost as an afterthought, by a man whose hand had started to shake. In the last weeks, he had been able to hold a pencil at all. The drawing was of a new milestone. Simple, rectangular, the shape of a granite post cut fresh from a quarry block. Beneath the drawing in her father's hand in the letters that were shakier than the rest of the notebook, but still unmistakably his. If you cannot find 3 and 9 by the spring, you turn 24, cut them. Use your grandfather's tools. They will hold. Wren closed the notebook. She drove the old pickup truck her mother had given her down to a small granite yard outside the town of Salisbury, and she bought 2 rough-cut blocks of Connecticut granite, each one about 3 feet long and 8 inches square. She paid for them with money she had saved from the Housatonic Valley Association, which had hired her in the fall of 2024 as a part-time trail surveyor and stonewall mapper at $19 an hour. She hauled the blocks back to the Tollhouse in the bed of the truck, one at a time, on a Saturday morning in April. She carried them from the truck up the overgrown lane to the Tollhouse on a flat hand sled. She set them on the stone floor of the Tollhouse side by side in front of the fireplace. She opened the leather roll of her grandfather's mason's tools, which her father had left her under the floorboard of the workshop in the small, iron-keyed tin trunk. The tools were good tools. They were chisels and mallets and stone punches and a small hammer with a head her grandfather had reground himself in 1953. She spent 3 weekends cutting the first stone to shape. She spent 3 more weekends cutting the second. She carved the number 3 into the face of the first stone with her father's chisels and her grandfather's mason's hammer, working slowly, working the way her father had worked, measuring twice. She carved the number 9 into the face of the second stone. On the buried corner of each stone in small, neat letters, no larger than her thumbnail, she carved 3 marks: a period, a letter, a period, a second letter, a period, a 4-digit year, WC 2027. She hauled the first stone down the turnpike to the footing of milestone 3 on the Sunday morning of May 24th, 2027. She hauled the second stone to the footing of milestone 9 on the Sunday morning of May 31st. She set them in lime mortar she had mixed herself. She packed their footings with wedge stones from the forest floor. She stepped back and looked at them in the morning light. They stood. On a clear evening in late October of 2027, she sat on the fallen trunk of a white oak that had come down across the old turnpike lane, 50 yards south of the Tollhouse, and she watched the last copper light fade through the hardwood canopy. The sugar maples along the lane had turned the specific burnt orange that Litchfield Hills sugar maples turn in the last week of October. The Tollhouse behind her was a dark square shape against the trees, its slate roof catching the last of the light. The smoke from her fireplace rose straight up through the canopy into the cold, still air of evening. She thought about her father. She thought about Silas Hatcher, who had walked the 11-mile turnpike every spring for 41 years, and who had sealed an iron toll box and a linen survey map inside the west wall of a stone building on the last day of the turnpike's life, because he had understood that some things do not belong to any company, and some things only belong to the next person with the hand to find them. She thought about her mother, who had driven the same 57-mile mail route 6 days a week for 23 years in a right-hand drive Jeep, and who had taught her daughter that repetition is not boredom. Repetition is how you learn what has changed. She thought about her father again. Alden Calloway had not been teaching her a skill. He had been teaching her a trade. He had been teaching her the trade his own father had taught him on the granite work sites of the Connecticut State Highway Department in the 1950s. He had been teaching her in small installments across the 10 years of their overlap how to take her place in a line of people who have known from the beginning of stonework that the wall outlasts the man and that the only thing that fails in the end is the people who stop paying attention. He had passed her the trade, and she had passed it on. Milestone 3 and Milestone 9 of the Goshen Cornwall Turnpike were standing, both of them in their original footings on the old abandoned road, each of them carved fresh out of Connecticut granite in the spring of 2027 by a 24-year-old stonemason who had taught herself the work out of her grandfather's leather tool roll and her father's shaky last drawing in her own 2 hands. At the buried corner of each stone, 3 marks had been carved where only the next person to lift them would ever see them. WC 2027. When the light was gone, Wren Calloway stood up from the log. She walked back to the toll house in the gathering dark. She pushed open the oak plank door. She stepped inside. She shut the door behind her. She crossed the stone floor to the fireplace where the iron stove was burning low, and the iron toll box of Silas Hatcher sat on the wooden shelf above the mantel, beside the framed photograph of her father at his workbench, and the 11 leather-bound notebooks of Alden Calloway sat on a shelf she had built along the north wall next to her own 11 canvas-bound notebooks. She fed 2 more sticks into the stove. She sat down on her cot in front of the fire. She pulled one of her father's wool blankets up over her knees, and she opened her current notebook to the page she had been working on that morning, and she began to write in pencil in the small, neat hand she had been writing in since she was 12 years old. Wren Calloway was 21 years old, and she had just been put out. She had $1 to her name, and she spent it on a crumbling stone toll house on a stretch of abandoned turnpike in the Litchfield Hills of northwest Connecticut. It was the best dollar she ever spent.